Morning. So, just finished grading your Chapter 9 test and wanted to talk through test corrections with you real quick. So, if you haven't already grabbed your test, can we please pause this video and go to the back of the room and get your test out of your turn back folder. So, go ahead and pause the video and go get your test now. Okay, so now that you have your test back, you're all looking through it and so forth, but I need you to pay attention to me now and make sure you listen to some careful directions about how to do corrections. And I'm also going to walk through a couple of the problems here to give you a bit of a head start on the corrections. Overall, your tests were okay. It's fairly common. It's been the last few years that this happens where the grades are not so great on the first test, and I think there's just kind of an adjustment period, and there's a couple of little details that I emphasized probably more than you were anticipating. So we'll talk about some of that. But ultimately, don't panic. This has happened a number of years where there's a lot of scores where students aren't probably as high as they'd like to be. It's okay. You're going to have the chance to retake it. We're going to keep emphasizing the same material. So if you're nervous and you feel like, this is not what I'm used to, don't worry. We're going to have a lot of chances to correct it, and you're going to keep growing. So we'll do the corrections, and then in the next week or two, you can work on getting ready to retake it. And I think you'll find that it will start to click, and you'll get a lot better. So don't panic yet if your grade wasn't what you had hoped for. So let's talk about corrections. First thing, here are your directions. Here are the major points. So corrections, you will do them on a separate sheet of paper. Separate sheet of paper. Do not do your corrections on the original test. Do them on a separate sheet of paper, making sure you put your name on both, please. Obviously, your name's already on your test, but make sure you put your name on your corrections. So corrections are, you will redo every problem that you lost any amount of credit on at all. So even if you lost 1 point for a sign error, you're going to redo the problem. So what that means, you're going to rewrite the problem, including the directions. So you'll pick the number, whatever it is. If it's number 7, you're going to actually write these directions out, because that's an important part of the corrections, is that you recognize how you misread the directions. Also, so I can see what the question was asking, because I don't have the entire test memorized, and I don't want to have to flip through everybody's test all the time. So rewrite the question, including directions, and then redo all of the work. Even if you did 5 out of 6 steps correct, and you got the last step wrong, you're going to redo all the work. This is part of training us to work through the problems correctly, showing our work, which I'm going to talk more about. So you're going to redo all the work on a separate sheet of paper for every problem that you lost any amount of points on. Once that's done, you'll turn it in. Corrections will be turned in with the corrections on top of the original test. Always turn it in with the original test. Corrections on top, making sure your name's on both. They'll be worth 10 points, so that's 2 homework assignments essentially. And they will be due generally 3 school days after the test is returned to give you plenty of time to do it aside from your regular homework. There might be some exceptions. If I give you a test back on the Thursday before Christmas, I'll make it due the Friday before Christmas, something like that. But generally, it's always going to be 3 school days after the test is returned. Okay, so since today is Friday, that means in this case, these will be due 3 school days from now. That will be Wednesday, October 9th, when these corrections will be due. So you have the weekend, you're going to get time in class today. That's plenty of time to work through it on your own, ask questions of your peers if you need to, potentially ask questions of me. So that's due Wednesday. Let's talk about a couple of questions here and a couple of major areas where we kind of need to tighten up a little bit. On this first page, by and large, you had a pretty good idea of what you're doing. There's one problem I really did want to focus on, and that's number 7. So number 7, it says express as a function of a positive acute angle. This is part of why you're going to rewrite the directions on problems, is you need to focus on each word of the directions. It says as a function of a positive acute angle, which means your answer should have a function in it and a positive acute angle. So this was where we said that we were going to use reference angles and simplify the function down So here, as soon as I see a negative, I don't want to deal with that. And I'm going to change that to its positive coterminal. And then, this is really important. A lot of you lost a lot of points for not showing your work on these problems. As I made clear, we need to show the work so you are working through the steps as you go, that you're making sure you hit every step along the way. In particular, you want to start by identifying the quadrant. And identifying in the second quadrant, is the sine function positive or negative? That is positive. And then finding your reference angle. So this is what I should be seeing on a lot of people's tests, and I wasn't seeing it as much as I would have liked, so pay attention to details here. In the second quadrant, the reference angle is 180 minus theta, so that's 50. And now we rewrite it as a function of a positive acute angle. That is the sine function. It's still positive, so it's positive sine of 50 degrees. And that is all we need to do. I do not need to know the function value, no decimals, none of that garbage. Just the sine of 50 degrees. 50 is positive, it's acute, we're done. Same idea for 300, or tan of 300. That's the fourth quadrant, where the tangent function is negative, and the reference angle is 300. And so then we have negative tangent of 60, and we're done. Don't write square root of 3. I didn't ask for the function value, I asked for the function of an acute angle. And yes, this is a function of a positive angle. 60 degrees is positive. The function value is negative, but that's fine. So pay close attention to directions, show your work, show the steps that get you to your answer. When you make a mistake, and not surprisingly, there were many people who forgot negatives or made some sort of simple computation error, and you just write an answer with no work, it's really hard for me to give you much partial credit on that. I was fairly generous on this one with giving you partial credit, not as generous on the second page, which we'll move to now. If you have other questions on the first page, work with each other. By and large, you guys did pretty well on this first page. The second page was far and away where we most struggled. In particular, a couple of questions I wanted to emphasize, 12, 15, and 15 was the really big one. So in 12 it says, you have an angle of 75 degrees. A lot of people drew the angle for me, that's good. And it says determine the point where the terminal side intersects the unit circle. The whole main emphasis here in our course, early in the chapter, was that sine of an angle corresponds to the y coordinate where we intersect the unit circle, and cosine of an angle corresponds to the x. So it gives us a hint when it says nearest hundredth that we're going to use our calculator. All we need to do is type sine of 75 into our calculator. That's our y coordinate. Cosine of 75 is our x coordinate. And then we write the two as an ordered pair. Okay, so just pull out your calculator. Sine is y, cosine is x. Pretty straightforward. I'm going to skip a few. I will say pay attention to rounding directions. A lot of people wrote this one to the 10th place. That's one that maybe is worth correcting, even though I didn't take a point off for that. Pay attention to rounding. This one as well, nearest foot. Pay attention to rounding. But more importantly was question 15. So I'll apologize for last Friday. We really didn't get a lot of great review in. Kind of just talked through the topics. What would have been helpful is for me to kind of make clearer, like, hey, you're going to need to find function values, because this was where we struggled the most by far. So sorry for not having a little more review. Maybe that's something we work on when I get back, is trying to have better review before a test. But this is pretty typical in this chapter. Even if I do review, students tend to make the same kind of errors, believe it or not. So anyhow, a couple of major points of emphasis here. One, this large, bold word exact was trying to be a clear indicator that you will not use a calculator. You have to make that connection that exact means no decimals. No calculators, no decimals. Exact means using the values from your chart. You should not have touched a calculator on this problem. Okay? So if you did put a bunch of decimals, I pretty much railed your grade, and you'll probably plan on retaking it. It probably feels a little harsh. It is a little harsh, the amount of points I took off, even if you have the correct decimals. but it's really critical that we understand the difference between exact versus approximate. And more to the point, the test is about whether you know how to operate with trig functions, not whether you can press a couple buttons in a calculator. So there were calculator active questions like number 12, 13, 14. Those were all calculator questions. So I had that in there. This was to see what you can do without the calculator. So it is a heavy penalty for those decimal approximations, but we need to make sure we're working with the trig functions, not just trying to find decimals. Okay, so exact means no decimals. Now, working through the actual problems, this is just like number 7 on the front. All we want to do is work through our reference angle process. So I'm going to say 225. That's in the third quadrant. In the third quadrant, the sine function is negative. And in the third quadrant, we find reference angles by doing theta minus 180. That is 45. So we know sine of 225 equals negative sine of 45. And our exact function value, so when we see the phrase exact value, we need to be thinking about values from our chart. Sine of 45 is the square root of 2 over 2. So our answer is negative square root of 2 over 2. If I saw this answer with no work, I still took credit off. As I warned you, you need to show your work. It is not enough to simply put the answer. Some of you think you're trig geniuses and you can just get to the right answer and you don't need to show any work, you don't need to think about it, and that might be true in some cases, but the reality is this test is for you to show me the process that you're using and to show me what you know. I already know the answers, so I don't need answers. I need to see process. That's what I'm trying to test here. Further, what I emphasized when we did go through this section was that the point of having you write these problems out isn't really just to show me, but it's to train your brain to correctly execute the steps that you need to execute in order so you don't forget little steps. Invariably, many people who didn't show work forgot to identify that the function is negative. So it's really critical that we show the steps so we train our brains to work through the process correctly. In a month or so, I wouldn't want you to be showing me all this work necessarily. I want you to be able to do that in your head, but right now you need to be showing the steps so I can see your process, and so you'll be training yourself in the right process. So B is going to be the same thing. I'll let you work through that. Use your reference angles to find those function values, plug them in from the chart. C and D, really similar. One thing to emphasize with C, it's 2 times cosine of 30, and then you add. So pay close attention when you do PEMDAS. A few people kind of read it as tangent of 60 plus 2 and then multiplied that result by 30, cosine of 30. But you need to substitute the cosine of 30 in and then simplify your expression. So this would be tangent of 60 is the square root of 3. Cosine of 30 is square root of 3 over 2. And then you simplify this from here. Just to be quick with this, those 2's cancel. And you get the square root of 3 plus the square root of 3, which is 2 square roots of 3. Notice I didn't show any of my reference angle process here because these are values directly from our chart. So those are problems where I wouldn't have taken off points for not showing this reference angle process because you didn't have to do it. Okay, cosecant real quick. I'm not going to do all of these, but to emphasize this last piece here, cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. So we really just want to find sine of 120. And so this would be using our reference angles. And then take whatever we get and flip it, right? Whatever that value ends up being, flip that result. Simplify it however you can, rationalize the denominator. So a lot of people basically had the right idea and struggle with simplifying. Ask your friend, get some help with radicals and that kind of thing. Okay. E, you could do the reference angle process. It gets a little convoluted, or you could recognize that these two are reciprocals. And since they're being evaluated on the same angle, they're exact reciprocals of each other. And hopefully remember, the product of two reciprocals is always 1. So this one we can kind of go straight to 1 because we just see that they're reciprocals. Or you could use a reference angle process and do it all out that way. Your call. I want to go to the last page real quick before this drags on too long. Sine is y, cosine is x. That is true when you're in the unit circle. So notice the difference between 17 and 18. 17 is the unit circle. 18 is the circle with radius r. That is not the unit circle. Okay, so in 17, yeah, you just give me the y-coordinate for sine, x-coordinate for cosine, and then the ratio of the two for tangent. But for 18, we need to figure out what r is first, because this is not the unit circle. If we zoom in on this, we'd see that this horizontal leg is 12, the vertical leg is 5. If you use the Pythagorean theorem, you'll see that that is 13. Once we know the radius is 13, then we can just use SOHCAHTOA for our first three trig functions. And then remember, the bottom three are just the reciprocals. So you can either just flip the results from B, C, and D, or you can use Choshikow, whatever you like. Okay, so I'll let you work through those, but all of your ratios should be ratios of sides in this right triangle, but you have to find that r is 13 first. So just real quick, sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Theta is functioning as this little angle right here. Sorry, OneNote's freaking out, of course. Opposite over hypotenuse is 5 over 13. Okay. The other thing to watch out for there is that this angle is in the second quadrant, and in the second quadrant, sine is positive, cosine is negative, and tangent is negative. So just make sure that you correctly apply signs to your answers. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine, so it's also negative. Cosecant is the reciprocal of sine, and then cotangent, the reciprocal of tangent. Okay, so just to try to emphasize some of the key points that really, or problems that really took a lot of points away for a lot of students. On the whole, again, nothing to panic about. Some of you, I'm sure, are squirming at the grade that you saw, but nothing to panic about. Do your corrections. You'll have the chance to retake them. Once corrections are completed and turned in, then I'll post the retake, and we'll talk about that next week, how to do the retake. So you'll consult the commandments and see that you shouldn't be asking to do a retake before Wednesday, so that I have seen your corrections first. Okay, so, but it's coming next week, you'll be able to retake it. But just want to talk through some of those problems. Hope you guys are doing great. I'll be back in school next week. I won't be doing your class for a couple more weeks, but if you see me around, you can ask questions then when I'm there next week. So looking forward to that. Good luck on your quiz today. Alrighty.